Welcome to this first video lecture of 2023. Happy New Year to all of you. Another lecture within our seminar series on the European history of Cologne in modern times. Today we will talk about the decade right following the end of the First World War. And we will do so from the perspective of those European states which, as a consequence of the war and of the international arrangements made in Versailles, of those European states which had turned into democracies, embracing liberal constitutions and liberal economies based on capitalist principles. Now, around 1920, these were almost all of them. With the exception of Spain and Portugal and excluding everything east of Soviet Russia, Europe was now a club of 18 democracies. In 1914, only 3 states could be called democratic. So, quite a success, I would say. If we would wind forwards in time around 1925, the picture would already change, as many of the new democracies struggled to keep their democratic constitutions. But for the time being, the pictures looked quite pleasing for those supporting liberal ideas. Self-determination of the people was now an established principle, and quite a number of new nation-states had come or returned into being thanks to the dismemberment of the Habsburg, the Russian, and large parts of the Ottoman empires, and thanks to the Versailles Treaty. Furthermore, the newly established League of Nations promised to coordinate this ideally free world of nation-states, of democracies, even though some prominent states were missing and large parts of the world participated as dependent mandates, the light blue areas here. Still, there was reason to hope for a peaceful future. And there was reason to hope for a brighter future, in which everyday life would shine enlightened by the blessings of electricity, transport, communication, media, domestic appliances. Daily life was revolutionized by electricity. The latest boost of industrial development had once again multiplied the opportunities for consumption. Assembly line production secured the availability of goods for everyone, transforming society into a community of consumers. This, in turn, multiplied the demand, which kept the demand for workforce high. Women defended their place in the world of labor and conquered quite a part of its most innovative side. So, as we can see, electric trams became part of urban life. The telephone, initially a status symbol of the rich, soon entered also modest households, and the operator needed to manually establish the connection was mostly female. So, while techniques boomed, the arts did so as well. The 1920s were particularly creative as a decade. A fantastic parade of ever more fancy imagination and style. Artistic schools and trends chased one another. Dadaism, Expressionism, Realism, Surrealism, Cubism, Pointillism, just to name a few. In music too, traditional harmony became outcast and replaced by free tonality or atonality, then by dodecaphony and serialism, so music that was both mathematically calculated and highly expressive. A similar variety blossomed in the field of popular culture, with cinematic blockbusters, still without sound, exalted dance trends, and various types of jazz and chanson. So here we see a typical Dada poster for Dadaism, or the famous Salvador Dali burning giraffes, or an example for Cubism by Juan Gris, one of his typical guitars. So far, the upside of the post-war period. But there was also a downside, which in the eyes of others prevailed. Europe had lost its nimbus, or better, its arrogant pretension of being the center of the world. The United States of America and the Russian-led Soviet Union were the new poles of the world, and Europe was left squeezed in between them. Colonialism wasn't over yet, but colonial power was not any longer unquestioned and under supervision of the League of Nations. Clearly, the beginning of the end of imperialism. World economy was still in disorder as a consequence of the World War. War debts clinged to all European countries, while new debts were inevitable in order to reconstruct and rebuild national economies. World politics were in disorder too, as the Versailles Peace Treaty not only turned old Europe upside down, it also assigned awards and imposed burdens in controversial ways, leading to a widespread bitterness and disappointment in Europe. Even worse, it caused a crisis of trust and confidence in many states. And I'm not talking of Germany alone, but also of the disappointed victors like Italy or France, and of the deeply unsettled populations in the newly created countries. New and old national societies, victorious or defeated, all had to face material scarcity and misery, political turmoil and confusion, generational and gender conflicts, and in some cases this even led into irreconcilable civil wars and revolutions. Even the consolidated victors, France and England, suffered from internal conflict and tensions in the immediate post-war years. Here just two examples of how artists depicted the ideological confusion of the post-war period. I find both pictures very impressive, especially under that perspective. On the left, we have an example by Otto Dix, three card players. Here we see the mental pain of clashing perspectives and ideas becoming physical and distorting the faces. While in George Grosch's picture Pillars of Society, the three men, obviously politically committed people, the three men in the foreground degenerate into mere containers or puppets of political propaganda, stuffed in their heads. So that shows the very tensioned state of societies, not only in Germany. If we turn to the German case, clearly the Weimar Republic, indubitably a great success for liberal democracy, was suffering from instability, both political and economical. Already a few months after its constitution, in March 1920, it was assaulted by a coup d'etat, or at least by an attempt of a revolt, the Lüttwitz Kapp Putsch, led by demobilized right-wing officers and soldiers. In Cologne, the failed coup caused a general strike and pro-republican manifestations, which is obviously good, but it shows that there was a pro and con debate ongoing in Germany of large scale. 1921, communists and left extreme radicals tried an uprising in Saxony. They did not go far, but it shows that the Republic continued to be contested from both political extremes. In June 1922, Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, a liberal Democrat and representative of the Republic, was assassinated by two far-right officers. His death caused huge demonstrations of solidarity among Republicans, again also in Cologne. But again in 1923, a right-wing coup d'etat fails, this time led by the young Adolf Hitler and a band of paramilitary National Socialists. It brought Hitler into prison and gave him occasion to write his programmatic manifesto, My Struggle. What also continued to incriminate the stability of the Republic was the continuing state of occupation. Rhineland, for years after the end of the war, continued to be occupied by Belgian, British and French troops. The Saarland was still under French supervisory mandate. And in 1923, the French government was upset about the delay in reparation payments and occupied even large parts of the Ruhr area as a pawn. All this generated major anger and delusion among German society. Here a few images from the occupied Rhineland. The tanks in front of the cathedral, British tanks. English-speaking advertisements in the shopping zone, doodling Scottish parts of the regiment, parading in town. And that was how it looked when the British finally withdrew from the occupation. That was in late January 1926, and when the last tank had retreated on the night from the 31st of January to the 1st of February, there was a huge crowd celebrating in front of the cathedral. Only the black furs are missing, as it seems. All these factors culminated in a roller coaster economic development, because you can imagine that all this political uncertainty does not translate into economic positive atmosphere. So debts and burdens and reparation duties overshadowed German economic and financial situation. Inflation was high already during the final war years. Stability was completely out of sight. The Ruhr occupation in January 1923, we just heard of that, and the immediate policy of passive resistance that was chosen by the government and proclaimed by the government, leading to a dramatic drop of productivity, all this triggered a sudden increase of the inflationary dynamic, leading to a hyperinflation. The Republican government and the federal states didn't even try to stop the development and simply kept printing money on all levels. Central bank was printing money, federal states banks were printing money, and even municipal authorities printed emergency money, as the printeries, the central ones, simply struggled to keep up with the speed of the inflation. In the end, a total of, no joke, 700 trillions of marks had been issued and brought into circulation. This is a number with 17 zeros. It is still almost proverbial in Germany that people at the peak of the inflation literally picked up their weekly salary with pushcarts and had physical problems in transporting the money home. And then, nevertheless, it wasn't worth the effort. Here's some nice impressive examples of banknotes with fantastic numbers. While 50,000 mark is not that impressive, even though a single banknote with 50,000 marks is already quite something, 2 million marks are much more impressive, I would say, and you can read above written Notgeldschein, that's emergency banknote. And indeed, also the 2 billion mark note was a Gutschein, was a bon issued by the city of Cologne instead of real money, because they couldn't make it in time to print it. And the 200 billion mark note was already the end of the affair then, very lately, when already the reform was underway. So the uncertain situation of the early 1920s came to an end, and in retrospect it was the Ruhr occupation which was the peak of the crisis and which also triggered the hyperinflation of which we just saw some examples. Now, just to show you what that meant, the Ruhr occupation, this is the occupied Rhineland with the French zone over here, the Belgium zone over here, the English zone over here, and this additional part here with stripes in blue and olive, that is the Ruhr area. But the Ruhr area was economically, even if it seems a logical extension of the Rhineland occupation, economically, however, the Ruhr area was much more important than the Rhineland itself, as the Ruhr area concentrated most of the German heavy industry, including the crop industries. French troops, here we can see, entered Dortmund, and France above all wanted to pressurize Germany to keep face to the reparation payments. But Germany simply was unable to do so, as the payments were due in gold standard and not in inflationary paper marks. Trying to extract the reparations by force didn't work, as Germans refused to cooperate, and work performance dropped significantly during the occupation, and protests were loud also in the rest of Germany. Here we can see pictures from a sports event in Munich, and they protested also there. So when the French signaled to stop the Ruhr occupation, understanding that they wouldn't go further with that, the German government decided a radical cure for the hyperinflation, a monetary reform, or better, a monetary reset. How do you reset your money? Well, by simply devaluating your old money and issuing new money in relation to concrete value. Now, that is the big problem. How do you create a measurement for concrete value? In the case of Germany, the central bank mortgaged the entire real estate of Germany. All buildings and premises, all physical properties were evaluated and set under hypothek. The value of this theoretical buyout of Germany, something like a gigantic home loan, was calculated to be 3.2 billion Reichsmark, according to the gold standard, of course. And this was the amount to be issued in new money. Rentenmark, that was the name. And you know what? It worked. People immediately placed their trust in the new currency, and since the state did not increase the amount of money in circulation, the new currency kept its value and worked as the new monetary standard in Germany. A few examples, and as you see, the new bills looked a little less fancy and a bit more austere, but they did the job and worked well. Here we have 10 Rentenmark, 10, and here we have 100 Rentenmark. Some amounts which are a little more practical for everyday calculation. At the same time, the reparation issue was tackled more seriously on the international scene. A first step forward was provided by the Dawes Plan, which did not really reduce the amount of reparation, but it did change the schedules and the system of payment. It established some kind of agency which ensured that payments and German economic performance correlated instead of being dramatically incongruent. And a few years later, the Young Plan, a result of 2 international congresses in The Hague, significantly recalibrated and reduced the reparations, bringing them to a more realistic and reasonable level. Here we see the first American gold payments arriving as per the Dawes Plan to America, German gold to America, of course. The opening of the second Hague conference, that is the next picture, that was one of the 2 conferences that aimed at implementing the Young Plan. And that was in 1929 and in 1930. But by that time it was already too late, as you know, given the devastating effects of the Great Depression, caused not the least by Germany's faltering and depressed economy. A real breakthrough, however, was reached with the Locarno treaties, which helped to ease some of the most burning open tensions left by the Versailles Treaty. Locarno was a multilateral conference in the city of Locarno. That's where the name comes from. The Locarno Conference was in 1925, and it resulted in 7 distinct treaties. All 7 focused on guaranteeing post-war borders and re-establishing a minimum of trust into international relations. It was important for Germany as it allowed the Weimar Republic to make a step forward and become respected for being the new Germany, and not only the heir of the German Empire. It was important for Germany's neighbors as it assured them the status quo of the borders as drawn by the Versailles Treaty. In the case of the western borders, these guarantees were even definitive and helped to restore the relation with France and Belgium. With view to the eastern borders, at least an agreement was reached that any territorial changes would be made consensual and based on prior negotiations. The latter, obviously, was an unsatisfactory result, which later opened the door for further revanchist claims from the Hitler government. But for the time being, it was a progress. Germany was now readmitted to international organizations, including the League of Nations. Hence, it was now accepted and respected as a diplomatic partner. And here we see the masterminds of the Locarno treaties, and that is from left to right, Gustav Stresemann, the German foreign minister, Joseph Austin Chamberlain, the British foreign minister, and Aristide Briand, the French prime and foreign minister, who were the leading figures during the conference, even though other diplomatic corps from other nations did participate as well, of course. Now, this change allowed for a period of relative pacification in Europe, and for consolidation also of the Weimar Republic, by the way. And it gave a rest to the inquietudes of the post-war era. It was the basis for what we know today as the Roaring Twenties, or in French, les années folles, or in German, die goldenen Zwanziger. A frantic period known for a somewhat eccentric, extravagant and unrestrained liberal lifestyle, full of colors and styles, entertainments and creativity, and luscious and lush nightlives. Nevertheless, while the popular moods took a rest, the economic situation recovered only in part. All European countries suffered from war damages and war debts and continued to do so. All started a national reconstruction process, but transnational economic interaction never reached pre-war levels and remained dysfunctional, also in terms of supply chains and trade exchange. Most of the capital that kept European business going came from the USA. And this North American funding capacity was in turn financed by repayments of war debts from Europe. After all, this was an insane, absurd circulation of financing, which was destined to overheat soon. But this will be the subject of next week's session. For this week, we end with a rather positive note. Les années folles à Paris, Josephine Baker's star of the Casino de Paris, and many shows and reviews of the time. And in Berlin, amusement temples like the Haus Vaterland, the Fatherland House in Berlin, were symbols for the new freedoms of the 1920s. Cologne was vastly participating at the hype of the Golden Twenties, as we will see in the next video lecture dedicated to the situation in Cologne. So far for the moment. Thanks for your attention.